The night over Tortuga was heavy with salt and silence. Only the whisper of the tide dared to disturb the stillness as a solitary pirate dragged a wounded stranger from the surf. His name had long been erased from every crew list, every tavern story, every captain's debt. He lived adrift between guilt and ghost, hiding from a past written in blood and betrayal. Yet that night, as he pressed his only cloth against the man's bleeding chest, something deep within him stirred. The faint echo of the humanity he thought the sea had long since drowned. The stranger's eyes opened just long enough to murmur a name, one that made the pirate's pulse freeze. It was a name no man should have known, a name that belonged to the ghosts of his former life. He looked out toward the dark horizon, and for the first time in years, fear crept through his spine like a blade. The sea, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap tightening around him. The wounded man was no coincidence. He was a message. When dawn finally clawed its way across the waves, the pirate climbed to his deck and saw them. 10 ships, their sails black as judgment, anchored in silent formation beyond the mist. Each one bore the crimson insignia of a brotherhood he had once betrayed. The ocean, which had once carried him to freedom, now delivered his reckoning. The ghosts of Tortuga had come to collect a debt paid not in gold, but in loyalty and blood. He could have fled. He could have cut anchor and vanished into the endless blue like he'd done before. But something inside him, something that had been asleep for too long, told him this time was different. Perhaps it was the stranger's voice still echoing in his mind, or perhaps the sea itself was tired of running with cowards. He tightened the rope around the mast, lit the last of his rum, and faced the rising sun, ready to meet whatever the horizon had promised. What happened next would become a legend whispered in every corner of the Caribbean. The tale of one lonely pirate who faced 10 ships alone, not for treasure, not for fame, but for redemption. And as the first cannon roared across the dawn, the island of Tortuga held its breath. For every man who ever fled from his past would soon learn that the tide always remembers. The storm that had carried the wounded man to the pirates' shore seemed to linger in the air, even after the skies cleared. His name was Elias Marrow, once known as the ghost of the northern reefs. He had spent years sailing under no flag, hunted by the empires he'd robbed and the men he'd betrayed. Tortuga had become his graveyard of memories, a place where the ocean's whispers were softer than the screams of his past. Yet now, the arrival of the 10 ships tore open every scar he'd buried beneath rum and silence. They had found him, and with them came the shadow of Captain Reeve, a name cursed in every port from Havana to Nassau. Elias dragged the wounded man below deck, lighting a single lantern. The stranger's face was pale, carved with exhaustion and salt. He carried no insignia, no coin, no weapon. Only a rusted compass hung around his neck, and when Elias pried it open, he froze. Inside was a faded engraving. "To my brother, so the sea may bring you home." His chest tightened. He remembered that compass. He had thrown it into the water 10 years ago, the night he left his brother dying on a burning ship. And yet, here it was, returned to him by fate's cruel hand. The man stirred, whispering fragments of a name, of a betrayal, of a fleet gathering under Reeve's command. Elias leaned closer, listening as the truth unfolded. Reeve had rebuilt the Brotherhood of Iron, uniting captains under one oath: vengeance. They had sworn to hunt down the man who betrayed them all at Devil's Bay, the one who had stolen their gold and left them to die. Elias felt his pulse pound like the tide against rock. He knew then that this wasn't just a man brought by the sea. It was the messenger of his own damnation. But something unexpected stirred within him. For the first time in years, he felt the pull of purpose, not the hollow hunger for gold or survival, but something purer. The wounded man, barely alive, had risked everything to reach him. There had to be a reason. The sea never brought souls together by accident. He patched the man's wounds with trembling hands, his mind racing through the old codes of honor he had long abandoned. Maybe this was his chance, not to flee again, but to make peace with the ghost that sailed behind him. As night fell once more, Elias climbed to the deck and stared across the black water. The 10 ships waited, silent and patient, their lanterns flickering like eyes watching from the abyss. The wind carried the faint sound of drums, the Brotherhood's call to battle. He knew they wouldn't attack yet. They wanted him to come to them. And as the stars began to fade behind the mist, Elias made his choice. He would not run. Tomorrow, the ghost of the northern reefs would rise again. Not as a fugitive, but as the last captain who dared to face his own legend. The dawn over Tortuga broke like fire. Elias stood on his deck, the wind pulling at his torn coat, the sea glowing in shades of blood and gold. The island behind him slept unaware of the storm about to be unleashed. He felt the old pulse of battle awaken inside him, the same rhythm that once made entire fleets tremble at his flag. But this time, there was no crew, no cannon line, no drunk laughter before war. Just him, one ship, one soul, and a secret that bound him to the horizon. He opened the chest hidden beneath the helm, the last relic of his old life. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the cutlass of Captain Reeve, the very weapon Elias had taken when he abandoned him to die. The blade still carried the dried stain of betrayal. He ran a finger along its edge, feeling the sting of guilt pierce deeper than any wound. Every pirate had his curse, and this was his, a sword that once promised loyalty and now demanded blood. The wounded man stirred again below deck. Elias descended and found him awake, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes. His name was Jonah. His voice was weak, but his words were sharp as broken glass. He spoke of Reeve's rise, how the captain had found survivors, rebuilt their ships, and turned vengeance into faith. Reeve had declared himself the judge of the deep, claiming that the sea itself had chosen him to punish traitors. 10 ships now followed his word like a prophecy, and at dawn, they would burn Tortuga until the ghost answered for his sins. Elias sat in silence, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. He thought of the countless men he'd seen sink beneath waves, of promises broken, of faces that haunted his sleep. For years, he believed he could outrun his past, that the sea could cleanse what blood had stained. But now he saw the truth. The ocean doesn't forgive. It only returns what you try to forget. He looked at Jonah and saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own shattered loyalty. The boy was his second chance, to fight not for gold, but for the soul he'd lost. That night, as the wind screamed through the rigging, Elias prepared his ship for war. He loaded what little powder he had, patched the sails, and carved a single word into the mast: atonement. When the first lightnings split the horizon, he knew the Brotherhood was coming. And though the odds were impossible, his eyes burned with a strange calm. The sea had given him one last dawn, one last battle, one last chance to rewrite the ending of his story. And he would meet it, not as a ghost, but as a man. As the horizon burned with the first light of dawn, Elias stood motionless at the bow of his ship. The mist rolled in thick, swallowing the outlines of the waiting fleet. Somewhere beyond that shroud, 10 ships drifted like predators circling wounded prey. He could almost hear their cannons breathing, their ropes groaning, their decks alive with vengeance. He felt no fear, only the slow, deliberate heartbeat of destiny pulsing in his chest. This was the end of every road he had walked, every coin he had stolen, every sin the sea had carried for him. He turned as Jonah limped up from below deck, pale and trembling, but alive. The young man's face was lit by determination, his wounds barely closed. He held the compass that once belonged to Elias's brother. He wanted you to have it, Jonah said softly. He died believing you'd come back. Those words cut deeper than any blade. For years, Elias had told himself that abandoning his brother had been survival, not betrayal. But hearing those words shattered the illusion. The compass wasn't just a reminder of loss. It was a map leading him back to who he once was. A thunderous sound broke the silence, a signal cannon from the lead ship. The Brotherhood was calling him out. Elias knew the code. They wanted a parley, one last chance for surrender. He smiled bitterly. Reeve never did anything without spectacle. The man was more serpent than sailor, and his vengeance was always dressed in ceremony. Elias looked at Jonah. "Stay here," he said, gripping the wheel. "If I don't return before the tide turns, set the ship aflame. Don't let them have it." The boy tried to protest, but Elias's eyes silenced him, eyes of a man who had already made peace with death. He rode alone through the fog, each pull of the oars echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet sea. As he neared the flagship, the mist parted to reveal Reeves' monstrous vessel, the vengeance of God. Its black hull rose like a cathedral of death, cannons glinting beneath tattered flags. The sight of it struck Elias with a strange mix of dread and nostalgia. This was once his home. These were once his men. And now, they waited to hang him from the very mast he had commanded. When he climbed aboard, silence fell. Dozens of hardened faces watched him, with hate burning behind their eyes. At the far end of the deck stood Captain Reeve, tall, scarred, with a voice like gravel and thunder. "The ghost returns," he said, almost smiling. "Tell me, Elias, did the sea finally grow tired of hiding you?" Elias met his gaze, and for the first time in a decade, the two men who had once called each other brothers stood face to face, bound not by loyalty, but by the weight of a single unforgiven sin. The air between them was thick with ghosts. Reeves' eyes glimmered beneath the rising sun, his expression carved in fury and disappointment. "You left us to die at Devil's Bay," he spat. "You took the gold, the maps, and the flag, and you let my men burn." His voice trembled, not with rage, but with the pain of betrayal that had festered too long. Elias took a slow breath. "You gave the order to raid the orphan ships, Reeve. You called it business. I called it butchery. I didn't betray the crew. I betrayed you." The words cracked through the silence like lightning. The men shifted uneasily, torn between fury and doubt. Reeve laughed, a dark, hollow sound. "You think that makes you righteous?" he sneered. "You killed your own brother that night. Don't speak to me of mercy." Elias flinched, but didn't look away. "My brother believed in something the sea could never wash away. You didn't kill him, Reeve. I did. And I've lived with that every tide since." Reeve stepped closer, his boots echoing on the planks. "Then let's finish it where it began," he growled, drawing his blade, the twin to the one Elias had taken years ago. The old pirate felt the familiar weight of steel in his hand as he drew his own sword, the same blade that had marked his greatest sin. The men formed a circle around them, chanting the ancient code of the Brotherhood: blood for debt, salt for oath. Steel met steel. The clash rang through the air, bright and merciless. Every strike was a memory, every parry a confession. Elias fought not for victory, but for redemption. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed, yet his movements grew steadier, more precise. Reeve fought like a man possessed, driven by vengeance so deep it blinded him. The deck beneath them slicked with sweat and blood as the duel stretched on, neither man willing to yield. And then, in a single heartbeat, it ended. Elias's blade found its mark, not through fury, but through sorrow. Reeve stumbled, blood blooming beneath his coat. The men fell silent. Elias caught him before he fell, lowering him gently to the deck. "The sea always takes back what we steal," he whispered. Reeve's lips curved into a faint, broken smile. "Then let take me home." The tide washed against the hull as if answering his words. And for the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of forgiveness rise within him like the dawn. The moment Reeve's body fell still, the crew's rage turned into silence, the kind that only death commands. The men who had followed him for vengeance now stood without direction, their loyalty drowned by disbelief. Elias looked at them, weathered faces, scarred by storms and choices that could never be undone. He sheathed his blade slowly, every motion heavy with exhaustion. "You followed a ghost," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I was one too. But the sea doesn't need more ghosts. It needs men willing to live again." For a long moment, no one spoke. The sun climbed higher, painting the decks with light. It was Jonah who broke the silence. The boy had rowed after him despite the warning, and now stood at the edge of the crowd, holding the compass high. "He didn't run," Jonah said, his voice trembling but strong. "He came back. That's what makes him different." The men looked between them, the young survivor and the weary captain, and something began to shift. The hunger for revenge that had chained them for years began to loosen, like a storm losing its strength after making landfall. Elias stepped forward, kneeling beside Reeve's fallen form. He removed the man's coat, the black one with the crimson insignia of the Brotherhood, and draped it across his chest. "No more blood for debt," he said quietly. "Let him rest with the tide." Then, He turned to the men and pointed toward the horizon. You can keep sailing in circles, chasing ghosts that the sea already swallowed, or you can return to land and start again. The sea will always remember our sins, but it also gives us a choice to end them here. The crew hesitated, torn between pride and the sudden weight of freedom. Then one of the older sailors stepped forward, a man with a scar across his eye and years of hatred carved into his face. He dropped his sword to the deck. "The debt's paid," he muttered. One by one, the others followed, their blades clattering like falling anchors. Some wept. Others stood in silence, staring at the man who had once been their enemy, now the only one who had given them peace. As the tide began to rise, Elias and Jonah pushed Reeves' body into the water. It drifted slowly, carried by the same sea that had birthed their brotherhood and buried it. The ships remained still as the current pulled the captain away, disappearing beneath the morning light. For the first time in years, the ocean was quiet. No drums, no gunfire, only the sound of the waves carrying away the sins of men. And in that silence, Elias realized that redemption isn't found in survival, it's found in surrender. By nightfall, the fleet had dispersed. The 10 ships sailed in different directions, their lanterns flickering like distant stars across the dark water. Some headed toward the horizon, others back to ports that hadn't spoken their names in years. Only Elias's ship remained anchored off the coast of Tortuga, battered but unbroken. Jonah sat at the bow, watching the sea swallow the last traces of battle. "They'll tell stories about this," he said softly, "about the ghost of the northern reefs who fought 10 ships and lived." Elias smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "Let them," he said. "But the story's not about survival. It's about what it costs to live." He leaned against the mast, the wood creaking under the weight of the carved word, atonement. The word had changed meaning now. It no longer spoke of punishment, but of balance. The sea had taken everything from him, his brother, his crew, his honor, yet it had given him one final tide to make things right. And in that trade, he had finally found peace. The moon rose high, casting a silver trail across the waves. Elias reached for the compass Jonah had returned to him and turned it in his hand. Its needle spun aimlessly at first, then settled toward the north. "Strange," he murmured. "It's never pointed anywhere since that night." Jonah looked up. "Maybe it's showing you the way home." The old pirate chuckled quietly, his eyes soft with the kind of weariness only found after long forgiveness. "Home," he repeated. "I wonder if the sea lets men like me have one." A sudden wind stirred the sails, gentle but steady, the kind that called to sailors' bones. Elias rose, gripping the wheel as the ship turned slowly toward the open ocean. The air smelled of rain and promise. Behind them, Tortuga glimmered faintly, its torches flickering like memories fading into the dark. Jonah looked at him, uncertain. "Where are we going?" Elias smiled, the first true smile he'd worn in years. "Where the compass leads," he said. "If the sea wants to take me home, I won't argue." As the ship cut through the moonlit waves, Elias felt the burden of his past drift away with the tide. He had been a pirate, a ghost, a sinner, and a savior. But now, he was something rarer. A man forgiven by the same sea that once condemned him. And though no song would ever tell his full story, the wind seemed to carry whispers across the water, of a lonely pirate who faced 10 ships at dawn and found redemption not through victory, but through surrender to the tide. The days that followed were unlike any Elias had known. For the first time in decades, there was no bounty on his name, no crew waiting for orders, no rum-soaked laughter echoing from below deck. Just the sound of the waves, soft, rhythmic, almost forgiving. Jonah worked quietly, repairing sails and cleaning the deck, as if instinct told him that silence was sacred after such a storm. Elias spent his hours watching the horizon, tracing constellations with eyes that no longer looked for escape, but for meaning. Each night, the compass gleamed faintly under the starlight. Its needle, once dead, now seemed alive, steady, unwavering, always pointing north. Elias began to follow it, not knowing what he was chasing. Perhaps redemption has no port, he thought. Perhaps it's a journey that ends only when the soul finds calm waters. Jonah, though young, seemed to understand. Sometimes, the boy said one evening, the sea doesn't guide us to places, but to people. Elias smiled, realizing how much truth could live in so few words. On the fourth day, they passed the remains of a shipwreck, splintered wood and torn canvas drifting across the waves. Among the debris, a small flag floated, one Elias recognized. It belonged to a merchant vessel he had raided long ago, the same raid that had begun his fall from grace. The memories struck him like lightning. The flames, the screams, the moment he realized gold had replaced his soul. He stared at the wreckage, silent, as Jonah watched him carefully. You could still go back, the boy said. Help rebuild what you destroyed. Elias shook his head. Some ruins are meant to stay beneath the tide. That night, a storm gathered on the horizon. Not the violent kind that kills, but the kind that tests resolve. The sky rumbled, the wind picked up, and the waves grew restless. Elias felt the pull of the ocean deep in his chest, as if the sea itself were calling him to prove his rebirth. He took the wheel, guiding the ship into the dark clouds. Jonah shouted above the roar, asking if they should turn back. No, Elias answered, his voice calm as thunder cracked overhead. If the sea wants to speak, I'll listen. The storm hit with all its fury, tearing through the sails and drenching the deck in white spray. Yet Elias didn't falter. Every gust, every crash of lightning, felt like a trial, a cleansing. The sea that had once punished him now seemed to be testing his resolve, as if asking, do you truly understand forgiveness? He held firm, eyes fixed on the compass glowing faintly in his hand. Even through the chaos, its needle didn't waver. And when the storm finally broke, dawn found them drifting on calm waters once more, their ship battered but alive. Elias looked to the heavens and whispered, thank you. When morning came, the ocean was reborn, smooth, clear, and endless. The sun rose behind them, setting the waves ablaze with gold. Jonah slept near the bow, his head resting on a coil of rope, exhausted but peaceful. Elias watched him and thought of how fate had brought them together, a wounded boy and a haunted man, both saved by the same tide. It was strange how the sea, cruel and merciful in equal measure, had a way of giving back what it once took. As they sailed north, the compass led them through waters Elias had never charted before, untouched coves, hidden reefs, islands shrouded in fog. One evening, as the mist thickened, they spotted lanterns in the distance. A fishing village lay nestled against the cliffs, small but alive, its fires burning bright against the night. Jonah looked at Elias expectantly. Maybe we should stop, he said. Trade for food, mend the sails. But Elias hesitated. He hadn't set foot on land in years, not as himself. The last time he had, the name Elias Marrow was a curse. Still, he felt something different this time, a pull not of fear, but of peace. They anchored near the shore, and as they rowed to land, the villagers emerged, wary but not hostile. Their eyes carried the weight of the sea, people who understood what it meant to lose and rebuild. An old fisherman approached first, his hands rough and scarred. You're not from these waters, he said. Elias nodded. No, just passing through. The man studied him for a long moment before smiling faintly. Then rest while the tide allows it. The sea always knows when to give a man a pause. They spent 2 days in the village. Jonah helped repair boats, his laughter echoing through the docks, a sound that made Elias realize how long it had been since he'd heard joy unburdened by guilt. The villagers shared food and stories, and when Elias offered to pay, they refused. A man who's fought the sea has already paid enough, said the old fisherman. That night, under the glow of lanterns, Elias found himself sitting among strangers who spoke of storms and survival, of lost suns and returning tides. He listened, silent but grateful, as if each word was washing away another scar. Before they departed, the old fisherman handed Elias a small wooden token, carved in the shape of a wave. Keep this, he said. It's not luck. It's a reminder that even the sea has mercy. Elias took it, feeling its rough edges press against his palm like truth. As they set sail again, he realized something profound. Redemption wasn't a single act or battle. It was a tide that came and went, one that only stayed if a man chose to meet it with open hands. And for the first time in his life, Elias Marrow no longer feared the sea. He had learned to listen to it. Days turned into weeks, and the compass led them further north, toward colder winds and deeper waters. The ocean changed its color, shifting from bright turquoise to dark steel. It was as if they were sailing into the heart of memory itself, where every wave carried whispers of lives once lived and battles long forgotten. Jonah grew stronger, his wounds healed, and his eyes, once filled with pain, now held the same spark of freedom Elias had lost years ago. Together they formed an unspoken bond, the kind that only the sea could forge between two survivors. One morning, the compass needle began to tremble, pointing not toward the horizon but toward the west, toward a cluster of cliffs rising from the mist. Elias frowned. The place was familiar, carved somewhere deep in the vaults of his mind. As they approached, he saw the remnants of an old harbor, long abandoned and half swallowed by coral and sand. The name carved into the dock made his breath catch: Marrow's Haven. It was the outpost his brother had built before the war, a place meant to shelter orphans of the raids. Elias had thought it burned decades ago. Yet here it was, waiting for him, preserved by the tide as if time itself had spared it. They stepped ashore, their boots sinking into the damp sand. The silence was haunting but serene. Within the ruins, the air smelled of salt, wood, and memory. Elias walked through what had once been his brother's home. Walls collapsed, lanterns rusted, but one thing remained untouched: a wooden carving of two brothers holding a compass between them. The same compass he now carried. His throat tightened, and for the first time, he allowed the tears he'd buried for years to fall. Jonah stood quietly behind him, understanding that this moment needed no words. Elias knelt before the carving and placed the compass at its base. "I brought it home," he whispered. "Forgive me for being late." The wind answered with a gentle sigh, brushing through the cracks in the wood, like a ghost's quiet blessing. For years, he had believed that redemption was something to be earned through blood or sacrifice. But standing there, in the ruins of love and loss, he realized it was something given the moment a man stopped running from his own name. When he rose, he turned to Jonah and smiled faintly. "This is where it ends," he said. "Not in fire, not in battle, but here, where it began." The boy nodded, his eyes shining. "Then let's rebuild it," Jonah said. "Not as it was, but as it should have been." And for the first time, Elias didn't see the sea as his punishment. He saw it as his witness. Together, they began clearing the broken beams, their laughter echoing through the empty shore. It wasn't just a rebuild of a haven. It was the rebirth of two souls finally finding their place beneath the same endless sky. Weeks passed, and the ruins of Marrow's Haven slowly began to breathe again. Fishermen passing through stopped to help, travelers offered supplies, and word spread along the coast about a new safe port rising from the bones of an old pirate's guild. Elias worked alongside them every day, his hands blistered, his back aching, yet his heart lighter than it had ever been. The man who once commanded fleets of death now spent his mornings repairing nets and his nights telling stories by the fire, not of treasure or conquest, but of the tides of redemption that can wash even the darkest soul clean. Jonah became like a son to him, though neither ever said the word aloud. Together, they raised a new mast over the bay, carved with a single emblem, a compass pointing toward a rising sun. "It's not a flag of war," Jonah said with a grin. "It's a promise." Elias nodded. "A promise that no man who comes here will ever sail alone again." The sea seemed to hum in agreement, its waves lapping gently against the shore as if blessing the vow. Sometimes at night, when the moon turned the ocean to silver, Elias would stand at the edge of the dock and gaze into the distance. He often thought of Reeve, of the men they'd lost, of the choices that had led them both into darkness. But instead of bitterness, he felt gratitude. It had taken betrayal to teach him loyalty, loss to teach him love, and 1,000 storms to teach him peace. Every man has a sea to cross, he thought. Some drown in it, others learn to float. Years later, sailors who found refuge in Marrow's Haven would speak of an old captain who never asked for payment, only stories. They said his eyes carried both the sorrow of 10 storms and the calm of 10,000 sunsets. Children would gather at his feet, listening to tales of brotherhood, betrayal, and the sea's strange mercy. None of them knew that the hero of those stories was the man sitting before them. Elias never told them, because the story, he'd learned, was no longer his. It belonged to the sea. And so, when his final dawn came, the villagers found his ship anchored quietly in the bay, sails down, cabin empty, only the compass left upon the wheel, its needle still pointing north. The tide had taken him once more, but not as a fugitive. This time, the sea had come not to claim him, but to bring him home. And in the wind that followed, you could almost hear it whisper, "The ghost of the northern reefs has finally found rest." The story of Elias Marrow wasn't about pirates or storms, nor was it about the clash of blades or the roar of cannons at dawn. It was about the tide within every human soul, the current that drags us through guilt, loss, and the long search for forgiveness. He had sailed through fire and betrayal, yet what truly redeemed him wasn't victory, but surrender. He discovered that the sea, much like life, doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for truth, for a man to face his reflection and still choose to move forward. And that choice, quiet and unseen, is what turns a ghost back into a man. As the waves carried him one last time, Elias became part of something greater than legend. The boy he saved carried on his name. The haven he rebuilt became a sanctuary for the lost, and the compass he left behind still pointed north, not to a place, but to a principle, that no soul is too far gone to find its way home. His story reminds us that redemption is never found in gold or glory, but in the courage to forgive ourselves for the wreckage we leave behind. Every man who has ever faced his own storm will understand that truth, that the calm after the chaos is not a gift from the world, but a gift we learn to give ourselves. In the end, the ocean kept its promise. It gave Elias what he had spent his whole life chasing: peace. And perhaps that's the greatest treasure any sailor can ever find. Not the kind buried in sand, but the kind that lives in the heart when the past no longer has power. His journey began with betrayal, but it ended with grace. It taught that even the darkest waters can guide us home, as long as we have the courage to listen to the tide. And maybe that's what we're all doing, sailing through the tempests of our own making, waiting for the moment when we stop fighting the sea and start moving with it. Because somewhere, beyond every regret and every wound, there is still a horizon waiting for us to rise again. Elias's story reminds us that no matter how far we drift, we are never truly lost, only waiting for the right tide to bring us back. If this story reached something inside you, then let it stay with you a little longer. Share in the comments what this tale made you feel, or what storms you've learned to face. And if you believe in stories that remind the world that redemption still exists, then leave a like, subscribe, and stay with us, because here, every story begins with darkness but always ends with light.